Hashoah programming. Obviously, meaningful conversations last night with Judge Coleman, which is available on Rabbi Goldberg's YouTube page. A very meaningful conversation with Mrs. Lichtenstein as part of Behind the Bima last night, a class this morning. And of course, now our featured presentation with Dr. David Bernstein, who of course enlightened us all last year with multiple presentations. And again, I'm so grateful for him for reaching out and availing himself to teach again here this morning. Dr. Bernstein is the Dean of the Pardes Institute of Jewish Education in Jerusalem. He's a resident historian for more than 60 Jewish heritage groups. Most notably for us, he led the group that Rabbi Goldberg spoke about so meaningfully and passionately on Behind the Bima last night. Dr. Bernstein was the historian for that group. That's what led him to us and to our shul. And we are grateful to continue to build on that relationship and please God for many years to come. So again, I want to thank Dr. Bernstein. And before I turn it over, I want to wish everyone a meaningful Yom HaShoah.
Thank you, Rabbi Moskowitz. I'd like to dedicate my teaching today to the memory of my 4 grandparents and my aunt, my father's sister, none of whom I met, murdered in the Shoah, and especially to the memory of my father, Alav Shalom, whose yahrzeit is Monday. It was my father who led my mother and all of their respective siblings, except for one, my aunt, to safety as they fled before the Nazi advance and wandered homeless in the Soviet Union for 3 years. Yom HaShoah is a time to remember the victims of the Shoah, but all too often, the memory is stuck on their deaths, on the murders, the massacres, and not on their lives. Does this give them full honor to their memory? I think not. Especially as the Jews of Eastern Europe, the overwhelming majority of the victims of the final solution to the Jewish problem, had created a community over many centuries that deserves to be remembered, as well as diverse responses to modernity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yes, there were still Tevyas and Goldas like in Fiddler on the Roof, but there was much, much more. So join me as we take a virtual trip to Krakow, Kurke in Yiddish, the royal capital of Poland, an Ir V'Aim B'Yisrael, an important Jewish community for almost a millennia. The Polish Jewish community, just a few introductory words, was the largest in the Jewish world for about 4 centuries. If I would ask you how many of you could trace your lineage back to Poland, I'm sure many of you would raise your hands. And if I asked the same question about Russia, I imagine more of you would raise your hands. So, surprise, those of you who think you're Russian are really Polish. Actually, there were no Jews in Tsarist Russia until the 1790s, when the Russian Empire absorbed the eastern part of Poland, and then those Polish Jews became Russian Jews. So whether you're Polish or Russian in your ancestry, you're really Polish. In 1939, on the eve of World War II, there were 3.3 million Jews living in Poland, by far the largest Jewish community in Europe, second only to the United States. And the United States had only exceeded Poland in Jewish population because 2 million Jews left Eastern Europe in the late 1800s and early 1900s and came to the United States. Of the 3.3 million Jews living in Poland in 1939, 90% of them would be killed. Perhaps it's better to say 9 out of 10, meaning only 1 out of 10 would survive the next 6 years. But let's first focus on the history of this once glorious community. Jews were invited to Poland in the 1200s from Krakow by King Boleslav the Pious, and once again from Krakow in the 1300s by King Casimir the Great. The Jewish population of Poland increased dramatically, mostly from what is today's Germany, and by 1500, Poland was the largest Jewish community in the world, a position it would hold, as I said, for about 400 years. We know Jews have been living in Krakow for at least 800 years, maybe more. When Jews first came to Krakow, they settled around the castle, at the foot of the castle. And that was symbolic of the fact that they depended on the kings for protection. But in the 1300s, the Jews of Krakow were expelled across the river to nearby Kashmir. And that would become the center of Jewish life in Krakow, actually until today. And here we can see a picture of Shiraka Street. And those of you who came to Poland with me a few years ago with Rabbi Goldberg will recognize this street. Shiraka literally means broad, Broad Street, or Broadway, if you like. And it actually is quite a broad street, as you can see from here. It's interesting that when I first came to Poland in 1991, this area was a slum. It had deteriorated after the war, and it was really run down. And after the fall of communism in 1989, it became gentrified and actually became the coolest part of town. There are the hippest bars and cafes here in Kashmir, and boutique hotels and youth hostels. And it actually has become the place where you would go on a date or go out for dinner on a Saturday night. And yet it's preserved some of its Jewish flavor throughout this time. And so let's look first at a picture of what Kashmir looked like before the war, in the interwar period. Here we can see Jews in, actually it is Shiraka Street in the interwar period. And our first stop on Shiraka Street, which is the heart of Kashmir, is the Altoshur. The Altoshur, built in 1407, the oldest shul in Poland, standing in Poland, and the second oldest in all of Europe. If you take a look at the background of this picture of the shul, you could see that tall brick structure. If it looks like a fortress, that's what it was meant to be. On the other side of the shul is the defensive wall of Kashmir, and the shul is literally built into the defensive wall from the medieval period of Kashmir. I apologize that normally we spend 2 half days or a full day in Krakow. What we're going to do is only 1 hour. So we won't be able to go into such depth, but hopefully one day, maybe we'll be able to go to Poland together. We can spend more time in each of the sites that we're going to visit and more. If we look inside of the shul, the interior of the shul, you can see there's a column in the middle. And there's actually a column after the bima also. There are 2 columns. That should remind you of the architecture of the Altoshur in Prague, if you were ever in Prague. It's a similar kind of architecture where 2 columns are holding up the entire structure. Similarly, the bima is surrounded by a black wrought iron fence, just like the Altoshur. Another similarity is you see those ribs in the ceiling. Every arch, interestingly enough, has 3 ribs and not 4. We believe the 4th rib is missing because it would have formed a cross. And the Jews of Krakow did not want to imply anything connected to a cross. You can see also that the bima is the architectural center of the shul. The Aron Kodesh is not the focus. I've never had the privilege to be in the Boca Raton Synagogue, but most synagogues in contemporary life, the Aron Kodesh is really the architectural focus. The bima is secondary. And we can see in the Altoshur and here too, that the bima is actually central and the Aron Kodesh is secondary. We walk about 50 yards on Shiraka Street and we come to another shul. The second shul built in Kashmir, and you could see the name, Beit HaKnesset Chadash de Rama. You can see it a little bit better over here, Beit Knesset Chadash de Rama. The Rama Shul, built in the mid-1500s, about 150 years after the Altoshur. built by the wealthy father of the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles. His father was a well-to-do merchant, and he basically built a shul for the family and really for the use of his son, whom he had sent to Lublin, to the first yeshiva in Poland to learn, and had now come back to Poland, to Krakow. Of course, it is a little bit funny to call it Chadash when it's about 450 years old, but that's what it was in relation to the Altoshur. And here again, if we look at the interior, we can see the bima once again with the wrought iron black fence around it, and it being the central focus, the Aron Kodesh being secondary, perhaps a little less so here. The columns are missing. Architecture had proceeded beyond that, so they were able to get rid of the columns, so everybody had an unobstructed view. I can't help but remember, as some of you might, Lahavdil Elef Alfei Pamim, Yankee Stadium, the old Yankee Stadium, with the pillars that obstructed your view, and not so in the newer ones. So again, Lahavdil. Here, the pillars in the middle that might have blocked your view are missing. Let's continue just a few steps away, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, with the Boca Raton Synagogue group that we went to Poland together, we were able to daven in the Ramah Shul, which is really a very, very special experience to daven where the Ramah davened, where the Tosfot Yom Tov, where the Bach davened, in a shul that's almost 500 years old. To put that in perspective, it was 200 years before the American Revolution took place. Jews were davening there. And I can't help but think of the funeral of Naftali Lau Levi, the brother of Rav Yisrael Meir Lau, the older brother, who actually saved Rav Yisrael Meir Lau during the Shoah. And when he passed away, Naftali Lau Levi, his son, Rav Benny Lau, who's a Rav here in Yerushalayim, the founder of 929, if you know that daily Tanakh study app, Rav Benny Lau said that in 1939, Naftali Lau Levi was bar mitzvah in this shul, in the Ramah Shul. There were 70 family members who came to his bar mitzvah. Only 5 of them survived the war. Here we can see the roof renovated. There was a number of years where the shul was actually closed and the renovations were taking place. And you can see here the beautiful roof as it was restored to its former glory. We take a few steps out of the shul and we come to a cemetery. The cemetery actually predated the shul by a couple of years, also mid-1500s. We call it the Ramah Cemetery, but really it's the oldest cemetery we have in Krakow. You could see here the wall surrounding it, and actually in the wall, you might be able to make out that there are shivrei matzevot, there are fragments of matzevot, because the Nazis destroyed much of this cemetery during the war years. It was restored by the Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint, and the municipality of Krakow in the 1950s. The matzevot that we see are from the 1500s and 1600s. Some of them can still be read, some of them are still legible, but many of them are not, due to the erosion of wind and rain and snow. The 1500s and 1600s were the golden age of the Jews of Poland, a time of relative prosperity, a time of security until 1648, when the Khmelnytsky revolt broke out, and a time of great flourishing of Torah learning. This is a time of great Gedolim, some of whom we're going to encounter here, buried in this very cemetery in Krakow. The first of the Gedolim is, of course, the Ramah himself. Directly in back of the shul is buried the Ramah. And it tells us that he died on Lag BaOmer. And for centuries, Lag BaOmer became a pilgrimage time for Polish Jews to come to Krakow to visit the grave of the Ramah. It also tells us he was the shepherd of his community. He was not a Talmid Chacham who isolated himself. He actually was very involved in communal affairs. And it also tells us, Mi Moshe va'ad Moshe lo haya od ki Moshe. From Moshe Rabbeinu until Rav Moshe Isserles, there was none other like Moshe. Something that is often said about the Rambam and said about the Ramah as well. The Ramah, of course, is best known for his mapa on the Shulchan Aruch. He was actually in correspondence with Rav Yosef Karo in Tzfat. And the Ramah actually wanted to write his own Shulchan Aruch, but when he heard that Rav Yosef Karo was already doing it, he decided not to. He decided to just make addendums, to make additions to Rav Yosef Karo's work that would reflect the customs and practice of Ashkenazic Jewry, as Rav Yosef Karo was a Sephardi rabbi. And to me, that shows the measure of the man. It shows a measure of humility. It didn't have to be his. He could just add on the notes that were relevant for Ashkenazic Jews. And in truth, every printed edition of the Shulchan Aruch, since the first one, includes Rav Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch and the mapa of Rav Moshe Isserles. It's actually, I think, a very beautiful reflection of, on the one hand, the differences between Ashkenazic and Sephardi Jews, and on the other hand, their ultimate unity, that they're literally on the same page in the same book. We walk up a dirt path to come to the kever of Rav Yoel Sirkis, known as the Bach. The Bach, the author of a commentary on the Torah, an earlier legal code called Bayit Chadash, which is often a commentary on Rav Yosef Karo's Beit Yosef, which is a commentary on the Torah. The Bach died in 1640. He also wrote Hagahot Bach that appear in most editions of the Talmud. Hagahot Bach is his attempt to try to correct what he believes were errors in the text using manuscripts that he had. The Bach admitted that in his younger years, perhaps he was too stringent. And later in life, he wrote, "He who wishes to be stringent, to be machmir, let him be machmir for himself only." He was especially mindful of the financial implications of his halachic decisions. When he died in 1640, he left behind many students, including his son-in-law, Rav David Alevi Siegel, better known as the Taz, for his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Turei Zahav. We walk on this path across the cemetery to the kever of the Tosfot Yom Tov, Rav Yom Tov Lipman Heller. The Tosfot Yom Tov was a student of the Maharal of Prague and the biblical commentator, the Kli Yakar, in Prague. And actually, he was appointed to be a Dayan at the tender age of 18, in no less than the Maharal's Prague. He also served as a rabbi in Nikolsburg and Vienna and a number of other locations. And actually, he was forced out of his position in Prague because of his defense of the poor. When taxes needed to be raised, he insisted that the wealthy pay the lion's share of the taxes. And the wealthy leaders of the community basically threw him out of the city. And eventually he came to Krakow when the Bach died, and there too, he was very concerned with the poor and would personally go and raise tzedakah for them every week in order to maximize the amount that people would give to help those who were needy. He wrote a special Mishaberach that you can find in some older Sidurim. You won't find it in Koran, you won't find it in Art Scroll, but if you find an old style Sidur. Shacharit l'Shabbat, after Yikum Porkan, where we usually say Tfilah l'Shlom HaMedina or the prayer for the government of the United States, you can find there this particular Mishaberach. I'll read in Hebrew. You can follow along in the English if you like. Mishaberach Avotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov Moshe Aaron David u'Shlomo Hu Yivarech et Kol Mi Sheshomer Pivu L'Shono Be'et HaTfilah. Sorry. One second. והקדוש ברוך הוא ישמרהו מכל צרה וצוקה מכל נגע ומחלה, ויחולו עליו כל הברכות הכתובות בספר תורת משה רבינו. It's a mishaberach for the people who don't talk in shul. And it's a great primary source to see that talking in shul was a problem, not only in contemporary America, but in the 1600s in Krakow. We walk out of the cemetery and we come to the Isaac Shul, I think the largest shul in Kashmir, built in the middle of the 1600s during this golden age in Krakow by a wealthy Jewish merchant named Isaac Jacobovitz. And this shul was decorated very expensively on the inside. The chandeliers were made of silver. There were beautiful woven tapestries decorating the interior of the shul. And you can see by its size, it's quite impressive. But actually the outside is quite plain, just white plaster. And there's a reason for that. Jews in Krakow in the 1600s understood that they had to make sure not to show off their wealth so as not to incur the envy of the non-Jews around them. Here's a picture of the interior of the shul today without the silver chandeliers and the tapestries. The shul was desecrated by the Germans. It was a wreck until the late 1980s and 90s when the Lauder Foundation provided the financing for the renovation of the shul. Today, it serves as the shul for most of the community, a small Jewish community living in Krakow, and for tourists who come to visit. If I'm not mistaken, on our visit with the Boca Raton Synagogue, we daven there Friday night and Shabbat as well. You could see it's done in the Baroque style. You could see the very large windows. In daylight, you really don't need the electric lights. There's a tremendous amount of light coming in, and that, of course, was crucial before the invention of electricity. We now walk a couple of blocks away from the Isaac Shul. We're still in Kashmir, in the heart of Jewish Krakow, and we come to something called the temple. And I think you could tell just by its name, we're talking about something a little bit different. The temple was built in the 1860s by a group of Jews called the Association of Progressive Jews in Krakow. There were a small number of these progressive shuls in Poland, basically one in every major city. And it reflects the beginnings of modernization amongst Polish Jews. Here, many of the worshipers had already left Kashmir. They were living in more upscale neighborhoods in Krakow. They were allowed to. Some of them had become quite wealthy. And many of them came to this synagogue on Shabbat or on Chag in their horse-drawn carriages and later in their automobiles. The rabbi had a secular university education, which was quite unusual in Poland, even in the early 20th century. He delivered his sermon in the vernacular, which in Krakow was German when Krakow and Galicia were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And from 1918, when Poland was recreated as an independent state, the vernacular was Polish. That was also unusual, not to give the drasha in Yiddish, but in the vernacular. The choir was mixed, men and women sang together. And if you look at the interior of the shul, which is has been quite beautifully renovated around the turn of the millennium. The Lauder Foundation was involved with others in restoring this shul as well. The bima that you see here is a contemporary edition. Imagine it's not there. The Chazan, as well as the Rav, actually stood on the bama where the Aron Kodesh is, looking out to the congregation. So in certain ways, this progressive shul seems reform, but in other ways it was not. It was not as extreme as German reform. First of all, the language of prayer remained Hebrew for the most part. The full service, the liturgy, reflected mostly a traditional service. It was not altered the way the Reform movement altered the Siddur. And men and women sat separately. So what we're looking at is one response to modernity amongst Krakow, or more broadly, Polish Jews. And that is, we want a little bit modern kind of shul that reflects our greater integration in society, but we still want a shul. And in the case of Poland, as opposed to Germany, we still want that shul to be pretty traditional, even if we are not so traditional anymore. We feel comfortable going to a more traditional shul. As we walk around Kashmir, we come to a building that today is an apartment building, but there's a plaque that you could see under the number and two signs on the top that tell us that this was once a public Beit Midrash, founded by a group called Chevra Kadisha Kovea Itim LaTorah, meaning a chevra of people who would learn Torah together at appointed times, at set times. It was a public Beit Midrash open day and night, and any Jew could walk in and start learning. And they did. There was a samovar, so you could have hot tea. When it was cold, I've actually heard from a survivor that it was a place to go in and just be warm, if you needed a place to be warm. And this certainly reflects an important part of Jewish Krakow. It was built in 1810, it was renovated in 1912. And it reflects the dedication that many Jews in Krakow had, even in the modern period, to serious Torah learning. Here you can see the two signs up close. The one on the bottom is fading, as you can see. It's the original. And I'm so glad they left it up. And I'm also glad they put up a new one so that we can clearly see what the words say. Memorialization is always a difficult balance. And here I think they struck a very good balance. Another response to modernity that's centered in Krakow is that of the Basayaku Schools. Traditionally, Jewish women did not go to school to learn Torah. They learned Torah at home from their parents or from tutors. Sometimes there were chadarim for women, though it wasn't so common, but there were such things. But for the most part, there weren't schools for women the way there were for boys and men. Sarah Schneer, born in 1883 to a poor family of Belzer Hasidim, had a great love of Torah learning. And she despaired at the fact that so many of her peers, that is women her age, a little older, a little younger, had no interest in Torah learning, were moving away from religious life in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And she was determined to try to change that. In World War I, when Galicia, where Krakow is located, became a very big battleground, many, many Jews from Galicia, including my four grandparents' families, moved to Vienna for safety. They didn't have to cross a border. It was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Krakow was part of the same country as Vienna. Vienna was just the capital. Some of them stayed, and some of them came back to their hometowns in Galicia. Sarah Schneerer encountered there for the first time religious Jewish schools that were teaching women. Those schools had been founded in the spirit of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch from Frankfurt in the middle of the 1800s, and had spread to Vienna, which culturally is German, had not reached Poland yet. There were also a few other schools, some religious, some not religious, that had already begun to cater to Orthodox Jewish women in Poland, but not to the Haredi community. And Sarah Schneerer comes back from Vienna with the idea of setting up a school for girls in Krakow in the same spirit. Her initial attempts fail. She tries to teach older girls, they're not interested. She bemoans the fact, as a seamstress, that young women seem to care so much more about the clothing on their bodies than about their souls. She has her brother take her to the Belzer Rebbe, and her brother, probably a little bit intimidated about what he's going to say to the Rebbe about his sister's plans, because it was so radical in the Haredi world. He says, my sister wants to teach women in the way of Torah. He doesn't say she wants to establish a school. And the Rebbe says, bracha v'atzlacha, bracha v'atzlacha. Maybe that was a Freudian slip. Bracha v'atzlacha, right? A blessing and good luck. Maybe he understood, maybe he didn't understood what she meant. She did not have, as the Haredi myth sometimes tells us today, she did not have the backing of the Gedolim that she would have later. They were still not sure whether this was a good idea. But she nonetheless pushed the envelope, opens a school in Krakow to 25 girls. Actually, it was a kindergarten. That's how she started. And within 20 years, she created a network of schools, by this time, together with the help of Agudat Yisrael, who not only joined the bandwagon, but actually were critical in terms of the funding and organization for the spread of the Basayaku Schools. So much so that she had to establish a seminary to train teachers for the schools. Her first teachers, she brought over from Germany and Austria. But eventually the schools grew so numerous that she had to train more teachers in Poland. And so she opened the first Basayaku Teachers Seminary in Krakow. This is the building, still stands today, in around 1918, a little bit later, 1918. And here, right next to the river, was where they began to train teachers for the many, many students. In fact, 20 years later, in 1938, there were 250 Basayaku schools in Poland alone, with 40,000 students. It was truly an idea whose time had come. And needless to say, it had spread already across Europe and would spread to America, Israel, and Australia as well. And all of this was done by a woman who I would call least likely to succeed. She had strikes against her to lead such a revolutionary change, a revolution in the name of tradition. This too was a response to modernity, because we all know education for women is a sign of modernity. It's why the Taliban in Afghanistan are so much against it. Educating women is a sign of modernity, whether in secular society, Jewish society, or the society of other religions. But she had 3 strikes against her to start such an innovation. Again, an innovation in the name of tradition. Strike number 1, she was a woman. A woman in early 20th century Haredi society in Poland. Strike number 2, she was poor. Had she been wealthy, she could have wielded much more influence, but she was not. Strike number 3, she was divorced and childless. And in those days, that amounted to a scandal. That was something that was way out of the norm in those days, and certainly in Haredi society and even in general society. And remember, Poland's a Catholic country, so around them, people are not divorcing either. So this is a courageous woman, a persistent woman, a stubborn woman who's passionate about her ideas. And this is another response to modernity, a response in order to protect tradition. Before we come to the ghetto and Nazi conquest of Krakow, I just want to give a snapshot of Krakow Jewry in 1939. They numbered almost 60,000. More precisely, about 56,000 Jews are living in Krakow in 1939. They constitute about 1/4 of the total population, about the same percentage as the Jews in New York at that time. So if you think New York is Jewish, Krakow was just as Jewish. Most of the Jews are involved in commerce or are tradesmen. The minority are professionals. But even though a minority of them are professionals, about 60% of the doctors and about 60% of the lawyers in Krakow are Jewish. The Jews of Krakow belong to different political and religious streams. We've already mentioned Agudat Yisrael, Haredi Jewry in Poland. There were also Bundists, revolutionary socialists. And there were also Zionists, Leminahem, a broad spectrum of Zionists, from religious Zionists to right-wing revisionist Zionists to left-wing socialist Zionists, general Zionists. They ran across a spectrum. And all of them were active in Krakow. There were even some Jews who were involved in the illegal Communist Party in the interwar years in Poland. And with this as background, and having looked at the centuries-long Jewish community in Krakow, let us come to the dramatic changes that take place in 1939. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, World War II begins. Krakow is conquered in the first week of the war. Krakow is in southwestern Poland, not far from Germany at the time. And the Germans, when they come to Krakow, immediately begin to plunder Jewish homes, Jewish shops. They create a sense of terror with beatings and random murders of Jews in the streets. They mark Jewish businesses as Jewish in order to facilitate the boycott of Jewish shops. They force Jews to wear an armband. They form a Judenrat, a Jewish council. In December, they close all Jewish schools. And they throw the Jews in public schools and university out of those schools, as well as the teachers. The Jews responded by creating an underground educational network for all ages. Shechita was outlawed. All the shuls were closed, their contents confiscated. In May 1940, the Germans prohibit Jews from entering certain parts of the city. They begin to expel Jews from the city in larger and larger numbers, most of them to the east, some of them to Lublin. In January 1941, a delegation of rabbis and leaders of the community come to the Cardinal of Krakow, pleading with him to lobby with the Nazis to stop the expulsions. They were all arrested and deported to Auschwitz and murdered. The expulsions continued. The picture that we're seeing was taken in March 1941, when the Jews of Krakow are put in a ghetto. Interestingly enough, the Nazis do not choose Kashmir as the location of the ghetto, even though it was the residence of the majority of the Jews of Krakow. Instead, they choose a slum area, Podgorja, across the river, as a further punishment to the Jewish community. They did the same thing in Lodz. They put the Lodz ghetto, the second largest ghetto, in a slum area. And here you could see Jewish slave laborers building the wall in March 1941. This is a picture of a remnant of the Ghetto Wall today in Krakow. And the Krakow ghetto was very small, physically very small. I think it was only 17 square blocks. Previously in that area, 3,000 people lived. But in the ghetto, the Nazis crammed 18,000 people, 6 times the pre-war number. The overcrowding was immense. It averaged 6 people to a room. Imagine what that means. Mattresses across the floor. Imagine what it means for hygiene. Imagine what it means for privacy, for modesty. It meant a few families shared an apartment, shared the one bathroom in the apartment, shared the one kitchen in the apartment. You can imagine how difficult that must have been, how stressful it must have been. In the spring of 1942, the Nazis begin to deport Jews from the ghetto to the death camp of Belzec. Belzec is where most of the Krakow Jews and most of the Jews of Galicia were murdered, including my 2 grandmothers. There was in the ghetto one pharmacy. The Nazis allowed the owner of the pharmacy, Tadeusz Pinkiewicz, to keep his pharmacy in the ghetto. The Nazis had this tension between, on the one hand, creating horrible living conditions, ripe for disease and infection and plague, and yet on the other hand, were desperate that those plagues not spread beyond the ghetto. And so they allowed Tadeusz Pinkiewicz to keep his pharmacy in the ghetto. Pinkiewicz was a Hasidu Mota Olam, recognized as such by Yad Vashem. Not only did he provide medicines for the Jewish community, he smuggled in more medicines, he smuggled in food. He acted as a courier between the ghetto and the outside world. He hid Jews in his pharmacy to avoid deportation. There were a number of other righteous Gentiles who should be mentioned if we're talking about the Krakow ghetto. One of them is quite famous due to Steven Spielberg's movie. Oskar Schindler, here is his factory today. The building still stands. Oskar Schindler came to Poland in order to make his fortune. He made a fortune on the backs of slave labor of Jews. And then something happened. He began to protect his Jews and ultimately gave away almost all of his fortune in order to protect his Jews, saving more than 1,000 of them. Quite a remarkable story. He too has been recognized by Yad Vashem as a Hasidu Mota Olam, a righteous among the nations. And there was one more worth mentioning, Julius Madrid. Julius Madrid was from Austria. He came to Poland, again, as a war profiteer to make his fortune. But he protected his Jews. He gave them extra food. He spent much of his profits to protect them. He saved hundreds of Jewish lives. Here is a picture of his factory. In Krakow, as well as in nearby Tarnów, his factories were safe havens for Jews. And he too is a Hasidu Mota Olam, a righteous among the nations. What we're looking at here is where the Jews were taken when they were about to be deported. They were taken to this square, known as Platz Zgodi, today known as Ghetto Hero Square. And it was here that Jews were rounded up to be sent to Belzec. And it was here that Jews were rounded up in March 1943, almost to the day 2 years after the ghetto was established, in a very brutal liquidation of the ghetto, in which 1,000 to 2,000 Jews were murdered, and the rest brought to this place, this plaza, in order to be sent to Plaszow, the concentration camp just outside of Krakow that's depicted in the film Schindler's List. A memorial to the Jews of Krakow was built in 2004. Note, after the fall of communism. And you can see it here, the empty chairs, signifying the 1/4 of the city's population that is missing until today. When the war ended, not many Jews from Krakow had survived. Of the 56,000 who lived there in 1939, almost all of them had been killed. Only a few thousand survived. And terribly, in 1945 and 1946, there were pogroms in Poland. Pogroms in Krakow, as well as in other locations. The most notorious was the Kielce pogrom of 1946, in which 42 Jews were brutally murdered. All of them survivors of the Shoah. Some of them had even been Polish army officers. According to Jan Gross, who wrote the book Fear, Anti-Semitism in Poland After Auschwitz, about 1,000 Jews, Polish Jews, survivors of the Shoah, were murdered by their Polish neighbors in the 18 months following liberation. This forced most of the Jews of Krakow and most of the Jews of Poland to flee their homes for safety in the DP camps, the displaced person camps. Ironically, they fled for safety to Germany, as did my parents. Of the few hundred Jews who remained in Krakow, they experienced 50 years of communism, in which all religions were suppressed. Many of them hid their Jewish identity out of fear. Many of them never told their children that they were Jewish. In 1957 and 1968, there were purges, anti-Semitic purges in Poland, further depleting the number of Jews living in Krakow and living in Poland in general. But if I can end on a slightly more optimistic note, even here on Yom HaShoah, with the fall of communism in 1989, some of those Jews came out of the closet. Some of them informed their children, their adult children, that they were Jewish, or at least that they had Jewish ancestry. Sometimes a mother or a grandmother on her deathbed revealed the secret that, in fact, you're not really my child. We adopted you when a Jewish couple came to us with an infant during the war in order to save your life. But I'm not really your mother, or I'm not really your grandmother. Those are typical stories in post-communist Poland. And many people come out of the closet also because in Poland, after the fall of communism, there's a liberal democratic government. And the liberal democratic government encourages the Jewish community in various ways. And just as I mentioned that in Krakow, in Kashmir, that neighborhood, actually, I don't think I mentioned it, in Kashmir, Shiraka Street, that neighborhood, which what became a slum after the war, starts to be gentrified. And actually, Kashmir, Shiraka Street, if we can go back to the first slides. In here on Shiraka Street, you could see how it's gentrified. You could see the restaurants, some of them with a Jewish flavor, even if they're glatt treif. This becomes the coolest part of Krakow. Today, this is the coolest part of Krakow. This is where the hippest bars are, the hippest cafes, boutique hotels, and youth hostels. And just as Kashmir becomes the coolest place in Krakow, so too it becomes, believe it or not, in certain circles, I wouldn't say everywhere, it becomes cool to be Jewish. Yes, cool to be Jewish. I've heard it from Polish Jews myself. Among a certain urban intellectual elite, not amongst all Polish society, there is a great interest in things Jewish. There is, in fact, even a kind of philo-Semitism among some of them. Just for an example, the JCC that we'll talk about shortly has 75 non-Jewish volunteers who come and man the desk on a daily basis of the JCC. The front desk is manned by non-Jews. On Friday nights, when they have a Shabbat meal, the waiters and waitresses are non-Jews who come to volunteer their time. The Jewish Studies Department of the Agilonian University in Krakow, the oldest university in Poland, perhaps the most prestigious, has a Jewish Studies Department that has grown tremendously since the fall of communism. And almost every single one of the students there is not Jewish, but they're greatly interested in things Jewish. In Krakow, in Tarnów, in Sants, in so many locations, there is a Jewish history buff, not Jewish, who's decided to help clean up the Jewish cemetery, to put plaques on the walls of former Jewish sites, to enlist his students in cleaning up the Jewish cemetery. All of that is true about a segment of Polish society. Without exaggerating it, it tends to be urban, it tends to be educated. Nonetheless, that has to be said, along with the fact that, of course, there's a great deal of anti-Semitism in Poland today, and particularly in the last decade, when the Law and Justice Party has come into power, things are less friendly for the Jews. I want to come back to the JCC that I mentioned, and you can see in this picture. I'd like you to notice that the gate is open. The gate is open, there's no guard there. There's no guard. There's no guard in the shuls in Krakow. Rabbi Avi Baumel, who is a rabbi in Krakow, originally American, made Aliyah, and now spends half his time in Krakow, has said that in the years that he has been in Krakow, and I believe now it's 4 or 5 years, he wears his kippah everywhere, and he's never had a bad word said to him. In fact, he's had lots of nice words said to him. He wears it as a magnet so that Jews might come to him and ask a question or inquire. The JCC has Torah classes taught by Rabbi Baumel. It has Yiddish and Hebrew language classes. But the story of how the JCC was founded is fascinating in and of itself. And it's a story I've heard numerous times and is worth repeating. Prince Charles of England came to visit Auschwitz. And as Krakow is the largest city, only an hour and a quarter away from Auschwitz, he stayed over in Auschwitz. And after the visit, he stayed over in Krakow. And after his time in Auschwitz, he said to his hosts, I'd like to meet with some survivors if you can arrange that. And they did. And a number of survivors came to meet with Prince Charles in Krakow. He heard their stories, he was very moved, and he asked them, what can I do for you? And they said to him, you know, we're not religious. We don't go to synagogue. We'd love to have a place to meet. So Prince Charles said, I'll see what I can do. He went back to England. He met with leaders of the British Jewish community, and they developed a plan that went far beyond what the survivors asked for. Yes, there would be a place for the survivors to meet, and they do meet, even if in dwindling numbers now, they do meet on a regular basis in the JCC. But the idea of building a JCC was to provide not only for the survivors, but to provide for future Jewish life in Krakow. And the Krakow Jewish community is small, but it is growing. And here you could see a picture of it. next to the temple on the left. And what you're looking at now is something that only started a couple of years ago when the first preschool, the first Jewish preschool in Krakow was founded and housed in the JCC. I don't want to vouch for the halachic status of everybody in this picture, but let's say they're all descended from Jews. And it's a sign of the growth of Jewish life in Krakow, small as it is, as is this picture taken from their website, which is a how to run a Pesach Seder, reflecting the need to reach out to Jews who might want to adopt some Jewish practices but don't know how, which is certainly part of the story of the Jews of Krakow in the last years. While the Krakow Jewish community is a sliver of what it once was, it is testimony, nonetheless, to the perseverance, the steadfastness, and the resilience of Jewish life, not only in Krakow, but all over the world today. I hope this taste of Jewish Krakow will further your interest, not only in the Shoah, but in pre-war European Jewry, the world that was. I'd love to have you join me sometime on a real, not a virtual tour in Poland. And I want to thank you all very much. And if there are questions, we have a few minutes for questions as well.
First, I just want to thank Dr. Bernstein for a really outstanding presentation. And again, anyone has any questions is welcome to ask them right now.